You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. And joining me today is a special guest back with us on the podcast. Some of you might recognize her, is Catherine Putz, the Diplomats managing editor and resident Central Asia hand. How's it going today, Katie?
It's doing good. Exciting week in Central Asia.
Yeah, no, we're very happy to have you back on. I know the Asia Geopolitics podcast probably doesn't get to Central Asia as often as we should, but it's a reminder that the Diplomat does cover the region. In fact, Katie has really put together a spectacular stable of contributors and is one of the preeminent voices on Central Asian analysis herself. But one of the things that we're going to be spending this episode talking about is an unfurling sort of Shakespearean drama in Kyrgyzstan, or at least what, to me, as a fairly ignorant observer who hasn't nearly been following this as closely as you have, Katie, certainly that's the sense I'm getting here. So today, as we're recording this, just I believe a few hours ago, the former Kyrgyz president Almazbek Atambayev has faced a set of charges, including conspiracy to commit murder. And I know that sounds very dramatic, and we'll get into the details of what exactly happened. There was a very dramatic nighttime raid on his residence. There's political rivalries here at play. But I'm not going to be the one doing the talking on this episode too much because, like I said, this is not something I've been following all that closely. But it seems fascinating, and it absolutely seems like a development worth elevating and covering on this podcast. So, Katie, without further ado, take us back a bit and just walk us through the cast of characters involved here. So I brought up the former president, Almazbek Atambayev, and the current president, Sooronbay Jeenbekov, is also obviously a major player here. What do we need to know about these men and their relationship, and who else is part of this story?
Excellent place to start because this all has to do with the personalities involved. So Atambayev was president of Kyrgyzstan from 2011 to 2017. He became president after the interim presidency of a woman named Rosa Atambayeva, and she was president after the second Kyrgyz revolution threw out of power a guy named Kurmanbek Bakiev. And Atambayev was a major figure in the second revolution, and he became president in 2011. Kyrgyzstan has term limits that they are trying to stick to, unlike the rest of Central Asia. So he was only president for one term, and then he had to step down. And so in the process of electing a new president, Atambayev endorsed Sooronbay Jeenbekov, who was a member of his party. Jeenbekov had been prime minister, stepped down to run for president. And so up until election day and maybe a month or so after, Atambayev and Jeenbekov were, a 1-2, a Putin-Medvedev situation, in a sense. And then January 2018 happened. And in January 2018, the Bishkek power plant, which had recently been modernized under a Chinese contract that had been settled when Atambayev was president, it broke down on the coldest day of the year. There was this massive blackout in Bishkek. And stemming from that, there was a lot of agitation for dealing with corruption. And so the Jeenbekov administration looked towards its predecessor and started going after a lot of Atambayev allies and using sort of the power plant saga to go after these folks. But the sort of heart of that tension, I think, was really that Jeenbekov wanted to be his own president, and Atambayev thought he would have a lot more influence than he ended up having. And so over the past year and a half, it's just been a steady drifting apart of the two. And the further that they got apart, Atambayev, who's always had a bit of a mouth, has been sort of lambasting Jeenbekov for being corrupt and a whole bunch of other things. Other figures that are important for us to remember before I go down the rabbit hole is a Chechen gangster, or an ethnic Chechen gangster named Aziz Batakayev. He had been put in jail in 2006 in Kyrgyzstan and was released early in 2013. And we can get into the details of that and why that matters after. There are probably a couple other figures, but really Atambayev and Jeenbekov are at the core of this.
Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about, I mean, this does kind of seem like a classic phenomenon that you might observe in a country that doesn't necessarily have the strongest institutions or rule of law. A president taking on his or her predecessor and clamping down under the guise of corruption to satisfy sort of constituents that are deeply upset about the issue of corruption. We've seen that playbook sort of in a majority of places, but Kyrgyzstan isn't quite a basket case of a country like that. So I was wondering, what should we know about the state of kind of rule of law and institutions in Kyrgyzstan? And were you kind of surprised at the dynamic between these two men, the way it has evolved over the past couple years?
Yeah, so I wasn't necessarily surprised by the breakdown between them. If you look at the short history of Kyrgyzstan as an independent state, it's every single one of the presidents has been hounded by their successor. The first president was thrown out of office in a revolution, and Bakiev, his name was Askar Akiev. Kurmanbek Bakiev became president, had led the move to throw out his predecessor, and then became a duplicate of his predecessor. And so he was tossed out of office, and Atambayev was supposed to lead this sort of change. And I remember when the 2017 election happened, it was a really remarkable moment for Kyrgyzstan where there was a normal transition of power from one elected president to another elected president. But really, this kind of gives the lie to that transition. That transition happened on paper, but then was followed up by a gentle nudging out of office and arresting of allies of the former president, who might be as corrupt as they're being charged with. But the problem is the reason that they're being charged with corruption, the reason that the government is going after them is because of their allegiance to Atambayev, not really because they're corrupt. There are other notoriously corrupt figures in the government who remain in government, but they're on the right side. And so that's where the issue of the rule of law really comes into this. And the fact that sort of politics and the rule of law in Kyrgyzstan is very personalized. So it's which guy is on your side and which guy is not on your side and what you can give to somebody. And Zhinbekov's the guy in charge. And so that's become really clear. And Atambayev thought that maybe he'd have a little more influence, and he didn't.
Right.
And so that's this sort of is. It's just an interesting playing out of a lot of different forms already recognizable in Kyrgyz politics, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's definitely good to be the king, as I guess Zhinbekov has learned. Moving forward to talk a bit about the sort of acute events that have led up to today's charges. Tell us a bit about the August 7th raid, which seems to really be kind of one of the most dramatic moments of this whole saga. I know there was a lot of uncertainty when that happened about how bad were things actually going to get. Can you tell us a bit about what happened and sort of your assessment of just how serious the events of that night really are for Kyrgyzstan?
On August 7th, Atambayev was at his home, which is a compound about 12 miles south of Bishkek in a village called Koytash. And he's got this 3-story mansion kind of house and grounds. And over the past 2 months or so, he's been steadily accumulating supporters who have put up yurts on the premises. They've said that they had weapons. They're essentially holding out because over the last 2 months, Atambayev has lost his presidential immunity. The Kyrgyz parliament voted to get rid of it. The general prosecutor had approved a raft of corruption charges and others that they were considering leveling against him. And he had been summoned 3 times by the Interior Ministry to come in as a quote unquote witness in the case regarding Aziz Batukayev's early release. So I had mentioned Aziz Batukayev earlier. He was released in 2013 when Atambayev was president. He was released early on for medical purposes. He had apparently been diagnosed with leukemia, but it turns out that was fraudulent. He didn't have leukemia. He was just getting out of jail. And so he is in the wind. And the Zhinbekov administration, I think, as part of its efforts really to go after Atambayev, went and found the dirtiest of the dirt they could find that they could pin on Atambayev. And they definitely can. He was president when this happened. It was a really shady deal. So there's like 18 some people who are involved in this case, including Atambayev now. But on the 7th, the authorities, after having summoned Atambayev 3 times, and under Kyrgyz law, if you ignore 2 or more subpoenas, they can come and arrest you and forcibly bring you in. It's part of the law. So they went and did that. But they did it with the special forces, like sneaking over the wall into Atambayev's compound. There were journalists on the premises because Atambayev is very much a public guy, and so he allowed sort of the Kyrgyz press to be in his compound. And so there's video of Atambayev shaking hands with people, and then you hear like a commotion by the wall, and Atambayev's security like whisk him away into the house, and then the like Kyrgyz special forces guys come out of the trees. And they essentially, I think what they thought was going to happen is they were just going to go nab him and then bring him back, and that would be it. But Atambayev has been very defiant, said he would not come quietly, said he will not flee Kyrgyzstan. That was something he had the opportunity to do. He didn't. He stuck around, decided to fight. The Interior Ministry says that their guys were only using rubber bullets. But Atambayev's folks also had weapons, rocks, guns. And so as the night wore on, it got more and more chaotic. Atambayev retreated into the house, which appears to have had sort of a number of fortifications, metal doors, things like that. And by the end of the night, one special forces guy was killed, a gunshot wound. You had about 80 people injured on both sides. Atambayev's people had held hostage about half a dozen special forces soldiers.
Wow.
And they released them the next morning, but there are also Atambayev is facing kidnapping, hostage taking charges. Thank you to that.
Right.
And so this whole thing went haywire. It failed miserably. The special forces pulled out. The next morning or the next day in the afternoon, they returned to the compound with a lot more force. They kept journalists back, so there's no video that I've seen of the second raid, though it might be out there. They cut communications to the compound. They did a lot of the things they probably should have done in the first one. And ultimately negotiated a surrender of Atambayev. So he came in the next day. He was charged with corruption related to the Batakayev case. And then today he was charged with a whole bunch of charges: hostage taking, mass unrest, illegal weapons possession, conspiracy to commit murder, all of those things.
Wow.
It was very dramatic. And there was a lot of there's a lot of room for criticism of the security forces for how they handled the first raid, but I also think there should be a little room for appreciation of the fact that they went in with less than deadly force, because you could certainly envision a scenario in which they go in, someone starts shooting back, they load bullets, there's a massacre.
Right.
And so that didn't happen. And I think that should be appreciated given the history of certainly this region of how authorities react to resistance.
Yeah.
Go on.
No, I was just going to ask you. I mean, so that was a terrific summary, by the way, really from kind of where this all started and how we kind of got to the moment we're at today. But I guess kind of like zooming out, the bigger question that this raises for me is, what are the odds of this persecution effectively of Atambayev for reasons just or unjust, the possibility of that basically polarizing Kyrgyz society and causing just a massive period of unrest that begins to have ramifications on the region more broadly. I understand that this is a very domestic issue driven by these powerful personalities, but what are some of the possible unintended consequences of first order and second order in the region?
When we talk about the big picture, I think it is important to keep in mind that this is very much a domestic issue. When we talk about Kyrgyzstan, a lot of times people will sort of focus on the geopolitical aspect, podcast, and sort of look at a map and see China and Russia and say this must be really important for China and Russia. But I really don't think it is. Russia has a role in this that I can discuss, but when it comes to the geopolitics of this, as long as this stays in Kyrgyzstan and they sort it out, nobody really cares who's in charge of Kyrgyzstan.
So tell us a bit more about the Russia angle here.
Okay, so at the end of July, Atambayev left his compound, which he hadn't really left in a couple of weeks, took a private Russian jet that flew out of the Russian military base, which is outside of Bishkek, the other side of Bishkek, and he flew to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin. And then he flew back to Kyrgyzstan. And it was really interesting because Atambayev and Putin both had very similar but significantly different in one way statements about their meeting. They both highlighted that political stability is the important thing here. But one of the things that Putin said in his remarks after their meeting, after Atambayev had left, was that everyone should unite around the sitting president and help him developing the state. So when I read that sort of struck me as Putin really saying, I'm not. You can do what you want, but can you just stop doing whatever this crazy shit is? And Atambayev, however, said, we agreed that both parties in the conflict should make efforts. And so I think Atambayev went back to Kyrgyzstan thinking that Russia would lean on Zhenbekov, but Zhenbekov had been in Moscow, or I don't know if it was Moscow, but had met with Putin a couple of weeks before that. And I can guarantee that this came up in conversation. And so Russia's interest in Kyrgyzstan at this moment is certainly stability. Medvedev was in Kyrgyzstan for a meeting of the prime ministers of the Eurasian Economic Union, like 2 days after the first botched raid. And one of the things that he said to media was Kyrgyzstan already had 2 revolutions. I think that's like its quota for the century. And so, Russia's interest is for them to just deal with this. And Zhenbekov is dealing with this. And Atambayev, I think, is going to be out of luck because Russia's not going to rush to his defense. Right. And that's the only other kind of option that he would have. Yep. No conspiracy, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, thanks a lot, Katie. I think that was a very helpful 19-minute summary of what appears to be a very busy few weeks for Kyrgyzstan. So, yeah, really appreciate you coming on the show to talk about all that.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah. And just before we go, for our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, please do leave us a review on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, any of those services. We really appreciate it. It gets the word out about the show. And before we close, just a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering this region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.